Welcome to CS5244 Web Application Development. Folks, we have a guest speaker today. Ian Nyquist is Creative Director of Nyquist Designs, a design studio in Silicon Valley. And he's kindly agreed to come and share some insight into what it takes to be a web and print or otherwise designer in the professional world. So if you have questions about how to get started in design, or some things that have been bothering you maybe about your websites, or how to approach design of your website, start gathering them in the chat. But I thought we'd just get started and ask a couple of questions, and while people gather their thoughts. So thanks for joining me. I was just wondering, how did you get started in design? What was the path that led you here?
Yeah, so I've always been that kid in the class, going back to elementary school, that was like, oh, Ian can draw stuff, or I would win the pizza poster contest or anything like that. So it starts way back, but that kind of led me to wanted to be, well, initially an artist, and then I would tell my mom would say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say an artist, and she'd say, no, you want to be an architect or a designer. So kind of pushing me towards more of a I guess professional design type of career. I went to school at Cal Poly for graphic design and fine art, and then afterwards worked at several different companies, Netflix, Frog Design, and ultimately started my own business.
So what sort of things did you draw when you were a kid?
Oh, everything, right? Robots, dragons, cars, the whole thing.
So if you were starting off trying to get into a design field today, how would you go about learning? What do you think you'd do?
Well, I mean, it's so much. Obviously, I'm an older guy, so it's so different compared to what it was when I was in school. When I was in school, you had to go to like college or take classes, and you'd learn about these things. But now, with the web, you can go out and you can learn a lot of different things. And I learn a lot of things just from seeing what other people are doing. So my biggest advice as far as like learning about design would be find out what's contemporary, find out other people that are out there doing great things. When you look at websites or apps or whatever it is that you're interested in, look at them not just from the perspective of how do I use this thing, but like, really look at the details and see sort of like from a designer standpoint, how does this feel? How does this work? How could I make it better, right? And I think you learn a lot just from doing those things.
So basically, when you're browsing around the web, it's always an opportunity to think about how you would design something differently, maybe. Do you have any sort of examples of maybe popular websites that you might want to fix or could use some work?
That's a great question. You put it back on me. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, let's see, there's one. So Slack is something that, to me, I always have issues with Slack for whatever reason. Their interface, difficult to figure out what Slack lines I'm on, that sort of thing. So that would be one example of a product. I don't know that I've thought through exactly how I would change that, but Slack is one where I'd see that's a big popular site that I feel it's hard for me to use. So, yeah.
So just in case anyone doesn't know, Slack's a pretty popular chat program with multiple channels that lots of people use at work, especially if you're in software. So you run a design studio right now. What sort of clients do you see? What range of clients do you see? Who are you looking?
So what's that?
Yeah, what sort of people, clients do you go after?
Yeah, so we have a kind of a healthy mix of like, large companies that you would have heard of. So we do a ton of work for PayPal, TD Ameritrade, SanDisk, which is part of Western Digital. We do sort of a lot of stuff for the parent company. Those are kind of our big ones that we're working with right now. We try to keep a healthy mix of like really large businesses, but then sometimes that type of work can get a little bit, I wouldn't say boring, but it's a little bit predictable. So I like to keep a healthy mix of the big companies and then smaller companies and startups that are looking to do something new and cool and want to explore, innovate a little bit. So yeah, kind of look for a good mix. The big companies, typically they're your bread and butter. They're going to bring in more of the cash, really. The smaller companies, it's harder to make business. It's hard to justify it from a business standpoint, but it's, if you're passionate about design like I am, it's the smaller companies where you're able to kind of flex that creative muscle.
So, Ian, I got kind of a couple questions just based on what you said. You know, you're a graphics designer, and we're kind of teaching, web application development. So, a portion of that is kind of web design. So, how, do people focus? Are there are there designers who focus on web design specifically? If I'm like Netflix or somebody else or Amazon, am I going to a graphics designer to design my website? Am I going to a web designer, or what? How's that work?
Yeah. So our industry is just terribly not well organized right now, right? So we're kind of for the last 10 years, it's been changing so much that you don't have these like clearly defined roles, unfortunately. You have some people that would call themselves a graphic designer, and that would include branding, design for branding, like logo design, print design, but also websites, also maybe some product design. And so you get these general practitioners, I guess you call them, which is kind of where I lie. And then you have people that are very specifically like a UX designer, and maybe they don't do visual design, they don't do any kind of branding, that sort of stuff. They're specifically UX designers, and their forte is writing UX, right? You have other people especially at these larger companies, you have people that have a design role that's specifically a visual designer for website work, right? Where they're going to be designing the icons, they're going to be designing, styles, style guidelines that the UX designers are then going to use to incorporate into their work. So, there isn't a very, very clear, it depends on who you are, right? So if you're looking to get a website designed, you're a smaller company, you might go to someone who's more of a general practitioner, like I mentioned in the first part. If you're a big company and you're like, hey, I'm going to design a website, and I have the luxury of bringing on like 5 people to do that, you might bring on a UX specialist, a visual designer, a dev team, that sort of thing. So
And UX is of course user experience design, right?
yeah.
So I mean that's kind of a follow up because when you mentioned how confusing Slack was, I mean the first thing I thought was, well, that's kind of, would that fall in the category of user experience design?
Yeah.
Like if you're trying to, if you have a website and it's so confusing, or maybe not so confusing, but if you see problems you can fix with that, that falls into user experience, does it not? Or
It does, yeah. And there's, to complicate things even more, a lot of people these days, specifically designers who straddle UX design and visual design, might call themselves product designers, right? And so they'll handle both UX design and product design as sort of one discipline. And yeah, what I mentioned before about Slack, for me, there's some UX issues there that I always stumble on. So yeah.
Yeah. I actually find myself using Slack, just scanning up and down to find which channel I need a lot of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So there's also the aspect of doing mobile design as well. That might be, you've got to learn a whole lot of user experience patterns if you're going to do an iPhone app versus an Android application. There are a lot of sort of things that people expect on those different platforms.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, uh, and mobile design, that comes into play with whether you're designing websites or products. it's a similar set of skills with subtle differences, right? So if you're just designing a website that's going to work on mobile, you've got to consider the fact that you have browser controls, that you have a back button, you have a forward button, you have refresh. If you're designing an app for mobile, you don't necessarily have those things. And there's specific things in the iOS toolkit that Apple would kind of push you towards, like, having a nav at the bottom, that sort of thing. So that maybe isn't the same for Android. So there are, a lot of differences between all these different platforms and disciplines within those platforms.
So I'm guessing that our students might, just talking about designing a website to be on a mobile screen as well as a desktop screen. What are some of the techniques or tricks that you can use to design a website so that it can handle different screen sizes?
Yeah. So I mean, the one thing that's really helpful is from the get-go to understand from your client how people are going to be interacting with if it's a web app, right, or a website. What percentage of people are going to be accessing this on their mobile device? If it's a mobile device, are we talking about an iPad? Are we talking about iPhones? What's the breakdown between Apple products versus Android? To really understand sort of what your audience is. And then from that point on, as you're designing, let's say you're designing like desktop layouts, you need to know that, hey, we're designing this right now and it looks great on desktop, but we need to consider how this is going to look and function when we move to a mobile interface, right? And there's a lot of, if you're talking about like web development, there's a lot of platforms out there that if you could develop in that kind of handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you, like Bootstrap or something, where the responsiveness is kind of built in and it gets it about 80% right, out of the box, and then you can kind of tweak on that. But I'd say, just to answer your question more succinctly, knowing who the audience is and how they're accessing your designs from the get-go and sticking to that is what you want to do.
And just to pick up on something you said, we're talking about something called responsive design, right? Responsiveness, that's the key word here, right? I mean, Ian and Dr. A.
Yeah, so responsiveness, sometimes I'll work with a client that's like our 90% of the time, 95% of the time, people are accessing this from their desktop. So there's a 5%, we don't need to worry so much about them. But I'll usually push them to say like, hey, if we just bump the font size up a couple points, if somebody does decide to access it on their mobile device, maybe it's not responsive in the sense that everything reconfigures to fit that mobile device, but it's not non-functional, right? So considering sort of, like I said, what your audience is, what the breakdown is. And then I always try to, even though, typically there's like this 80-20 rule, which is like, if 80% of your audience is experiencing your design a certain way, kind of focus on that, right? Where the other 20%, you don't cater to them as much. I typically try to whittle that down to like a 5% audience that's getting left out of the loop, if need be, right? To really try and address the full audience. So.
Do you, when you do work, do you sort of leave off at the design phase, or do you have people that do web development as well, take your designs and turn it into CSS and Bootstrap and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, we have a team that does the development as well. Running my own business, I find that we have clients come to us with a number of needs. So sometimes they're just like, hey, I just want you to take it through wireframe. So basically just kind of sketch out what the interactivity is, the main flows, that sort of thing. And then we have a team of people that will pick it up from there. Or they might say, hey, we don't have anybody and we need somebody to take it the whole way. So start with your wireframes, your general rough sketches, then apply visual design, then create like a style library, and then have your guys develop it, right? So when you hand it off, it's ready to go. So we kind of get a mix. We definitely get a mix of different clients, and every client is kind of different. So you just kind of feel them out and figure out what their needs are.
So a couple of times now you've mentioned a style library. I guess we haven't really talked about that in the course, but what a sort of, I guess it's important to be consistent, have a sort of a visual language that everyone who uses your app can understand. What sort of things do you put into a style library for a website?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, maybe I could pull one up if you'd like.
Sure.
Kind of walk through real quick. Let me see if I can grab PayPal's style library. 1 second.
What happens at the beginning of this course is we give a week or two for people to design a set of pages, and it's pretty compressed at the beginning. So there's a lot of time spent on getting things looking nice for a fixed set of pages, but it sometimes doesn't let us think about until later in the course how we need to be consistent across those pages.
Yeah. So, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Can you share?
I can, yeah. So, I'll just address what you just said, which is, you know, a lot of times, and especially with bigger companies, they'll have multiple groups working together or separately to create different websites across the to create different web pages across their main site, or to create different websites, but all have to fall under the corporate branding, right? So, and they all have to have the same look and feel and have the same experience. Otherwise, you get sites that say like, let's use PayPal, for example. You may be familiar with the main PayPal site is, but maybe they have a credit card servicing website. And if everybody isn't following the same guidelines, and you went to this PayPal credit card website, you'd be like, oh, this looks fake to me. I don't think this is PayPal, right? And so it's really important for these companies to have some way to communicate to their designers and their developers, like, hey, this is our visual language. This is the colors that we use. For example, if you can see my screen right now, like here's how this is how we use, yeah, these are the colors that we use, and we don't use any other colors, right? Here are the elevated backgrounds that we use. There's the drop shadow treatments. Here specifically is the fonts that we use and the sizes. And it gets more complex than that. It gets into like, hey, here's how we treat our hyperlinks. If we have tabs, this is how they're rendered. If we're working with cards as part of the design, here's what that style is, right? And you can see that it gets pretty detailed. This is a small sample of their style guide, but it goes through, for example, hey, if you have a date picker, this is the date picker that we use, so that on all of their sites, on any page of their site, you're not seeing these discrepancies between like, oh, it's looked like this like here, but over here, because then you kind of don't know what to expect from that company. And for any company that's putting a service out there, they need to speak with one singular voice so that they can build trust with you, so that you can be sure that who you're dealing with is who they say they are, because there's a lot of scams out there, right?
Especially for PayPal type companies.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I think I experienced that in my job. The Netflix DVD website closely matches the style of the main Netflix website for the same reason.
Yeah.
So when our designer took over, he basically just asked the right question. What does the streaming website do? Let's do that for most of our things. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That was interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, that's just one example. Most of the larger companies we work with, that's one of the first questions we have, which is like, they might say, hey, we need to design this microsite. And I would say, cool, where's your style guide? And sometimes that comes in the form of, there's different ways they communicate that. One is they might send you like a sketch file or a Figma file or whatever type of file that you would need. And it would have all of the UX and UI elements in that file that you could pick and choose from. Sometimes they might send you to, if you're more on the development side and you're less of a designer and more of a developer, they might send you to like a CSS library where it have sort of like what I just showed you, but more sort of interactive. And you could say like, click on like, oh, let me see the pickers and then the date pickers. And then it would say, here's your code. Just download the code. That's your code that we use for the date pickers, right? So they provide that to you all in sort of a library.
So then I guess the challenge of design is taking whatever components are in the style guide and assembling pages and experiences.
Yeah, I mean, so in that sense, some of the thinking has already been done, right? As far as the visual style and that sort of thing, but there's still plenty of challenges to work within, right? It's like, for example, with PayPal, I just showed you their style guide. I didn't show you the section of their style guide that deals with tables, showing the different types of tables. But typically these style guides are a great launching point where it's like, here's your foundation. And then someone will come along and say, oh, hey, we want to be able to put like multi-select rows within a table. Like, how do you do that? And you look to the style guide and it's like, they don't address that. So there's a couple of things you could do. You put on your artist hat, your designer hat, and you figure that out, or you go back to the design team at PayPal or whatever company you're working at and say, hey, here's a request, here's something we need, show me how to incorporate that. So it kind of depends on sort of where you're coming from and who you're working with. But
Ian, I have a question about the style guides. Made me think of, you talked about there's styles for colors, shadows, fonts, and you talked about hyperlinks, right?
Yep.
I mean, from a style point of view, are links different from buttons, or is that just kind of, I mean, I heard a lot about links versus buttons in terms of accessibility, but just from a purely stylistic, like, would that library of links, I mean, is buttons included there, or would you have a separate library for buttons, or how's that work?
Libraries are different for every client, but typically they would have different styles for links versus buttons, and how you determine to use one or the other. Sometimes they'll lay that out for you and say, here's when we think you should use a button, here's when we think you should use a link. My rule of thumb is if clicking on it results in some kind of action, so buying something, or I'm trying to think of another example, buying something or
adding something to a cart.
Adding something to the cart. If those are e-commerce examples, you would want to use a button. A button is a little bit more hefty. It's a little bit more like, okay, we're doing this, like click on this, right? A link is a little bit more light work where it's like, I might click to get more information or whatever, right? A button is a little bit more, it's for more.
Yeah, button's supposed to do some kind of action.
It's more action oriented.
And a link's supposed to take you to another page, whatever that means in today's world. I mean, we're working with Vue, we're working with, so we only have a single page, but I mean, like when I was looking at Amazon's website, they have a cart and they have what looks like a link for clearing the cart, right? Mm-hmm. But that's clearly an action, right? But they don't want to make that something that is prominent, right?
I was just going to say, the other way that you would determine whether you want to use a button or a link is, obviously links are a little bit harder to see, right? Buttons are a little bit more in your face. So if you want to manipulate somebody a little bit, and that's a lot of what design is about, is manipulating people to do what you want them to do, you would say, hey, I really don't want you to cancel. I want you to move forward. So the move forward is going to be a button and cancel is going to be a link, right?
Right. So like like in an e-commerce website, which is what we're building, we've got to proceed to checkout. We want that to be prominent, right? Even though it's going to like take you to the checkout page, quote unquote, but that's got to be your call to action, right? I mean, you're moving.
Yeah, you need to lead people where you want them to go, and part of doing that is like, with visual design, leading them. So you would say, hey, buttons, I want to put big buttons here to move you forward, and maybe I use a button that's in a different color, a less bright color, or maybe even back it down to a link, you know, that says to go back. So those are different considerations.
Interesting.
So, Ian, in your work, do you come across clients that have a lot of accessibility requirements? Do you have experience in designing for maybe visually impaired people?
Yeah, it's great because in the last 5 to 10 years, that's become just kind of the standard for a lot of the bigger companies. That accessibility is kind of more baked into their design style guidelines, and is expected, right? So, for example,
Well, how has that changed? How are they paying more attention to that? Font choice,
yeah, so
font
it'd be
size?
like font choice, in terms of the legibility of the font, the size of the font, the contrast of text on backgrounds. And there's tools you can go to. I don't have it offhand, but there's websites where you can go to check your contrast for accessibility. If it's low contrast, sometimes people are visually impaired. They wouldn't be able to see it or discern between different colors. So it's really about like a big part of it is text size. A big part of it is color contrast, making sure you got proper contrast. And the other thing is, in terms of development, is alt tags and things that readers can pick up on, that people with visual impairments might be able to need to access. So.
Well, another thing that I mean, this is just, Dr. A and I, Steve and I have talked about this quite a bit because I'm kind of starting to get interested in accessibility, and obviously he is too. He's had some stuff at Netflix, but like for example, I read a lot about with this, you know, buttons versus links, and in terms of CSS, the CSS tag button versus the A link, it just seems like every place I read on this, they got something different idea, number one.
Mm, yep.
And the other thing is this notion of keyboard navigation. And how should, you know, do you find that that is a subject that comes up, like being able to navigate a web page from the keyboard, or not so much?
Um, Not so much on the navigate from keyboard. I have had that come up, not so much in accessibility, but in terms of like efficiency. So for right now, I'm working on a web app for a big company, and they want to replicate. No, I'm not trying to replicate Excel, but uh, they're trying to bring a task that they typically do in Excel and bring it to a web application, a proprietary web application. And right now they've got a whole team of people that are used to doing things in Excel, right? And in Excel, you can tab through cells. There's a way to work with Excel with your keys that is super efficient. And I know as a designer that if you've got a room full of people that for years have been using Excel and you try to switch them over to a web application, and suddenly you're like, no, use your cursor to click on stuff, they're going to revolt, right? They're going to be like, no, this is way slow. So, you know, as a designer, I'm like, hey guys, team, we need to, whatever we do with the development of this, however we design it, we need to consider how these people are using this app currently. They are using their keyboard to tab through things, to you know, use their keys to move around. We need to stick with that, right? So, not so much accessibility, but it is considering that, you know, some people need to use the keyboard. So, yeah.
Interesting. And we're getting some people saying that they have had this issue too, and specifically with Excel and things like that. So that's interesting
Yeah.
in the chat.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, I see that now too. So, yeah.
Just a bit of a story here. At Netflix DVD, we have a lot of movies, and a few years ago, the Society for the Blind said, hey, we're going to file a lawsuit unless you get a little bit better at making screen readers work.
Mm,
So we spent a lot of time going through all our movie pages and series and seasons of all sorts of shows and making them all use the Aria tags.
yep.
So that screen readers, and there's a few screen readers that are much more popular than others. Um, and so we designed for the popular ones, which sort of is kind of like the 80-20 rule, but for accessibility.
Yeah, yeah.
The tags I'm talking about are called Aria tags, and I can't really speak to them any more than they're spelled ARIA, and they're interpreted by the popular PC and Mac screen readers. But I'd have to ask my real web developer friends at work more
And
about that.
I noticed that they also had so the there's Aria tags. They're kind of like labels. They're kind of like your alt to tell you what this either image or element is. But I noticed there's also Aria roles to tell you whether like something is a link or a button. And again, I was playing with Amazon's website, and I saw things that looked like link that had Aria roles as buttons, and things that looked like buttons that had Aria roles as links. So I thought that was kind of interesting with this, kind of mixing rules, because there are ways that the keyboard interacts with a link versus a button that can be different. And there's also been some concerns that when people who are using screen readers or who are visually impaired call the help desk for an application, and the person on the other end of the phone says, well, click this button. They're looking for a button, and the screen reader is telling them this is a link or something like that, and things like that. So it seems like a very complicated, I'm sure people are working it out, but
Is it fair to say that there may not be a standard around this, Ian, yet?
I'm not sure. I have followed guidelines for accessibility that other people have put in place, but we've not built guidelines for that. So had we done that, I would know the answer to that question. But up to this date, we've mainly followed the guidelines. So, and it's different for every company. Will have their own set. So.
Right, you have to follow whatever your client needs you to do.
Yeah.
Just switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask about how to learn typographical principles. So we spent a little bit of time at the beginning of the course with a textbook called How to Design for Non-Designers, and it touches on a few principles. Somebody help me out with what they are, spacing things.
it's not just for typographical, it's for design in general, like proximity, alignment, consistency, and what's the other one, folks? There were four of them. Proximity, consistency, alignment,
Yeah,
and contrast.
I use the word typographical, but what I meant was if you wanted to actually start learning how to fix up websites, like you can browse around the internet and see things that are wrong, but maybe you don't know what steps or what theory to get at to start making things better. Contrast, that's the last one. Is there a place, are there resources involved to work out how you can do that? Or is it just experience or?
Yeah, so I mean, with regard to typography, I learned mostly in college, and we studied poster design from the 1940s and 1950s is when typography, obviously that was printing press back then, right? But that's when typography kind of broke away and became an art form of its own. And I'm trying to think, like Jan Schishold is they call him the father of typography, right? So he's a great artist to look like. I think to look at. I think it's I don't even know how to spell it now, but I look at a lot of his work, and a lot of the work from these old poster designs and old designs carry over into what you see today in terms of contrast, positioning, alignment, those types of things. They carry over into the web world actually quite nicely, although there's new considerations with web design, obviously, but you know, those things have stand the test of time. And then a lot of what you'll see there is, you know, some general rules about like, hey, limit your font choices, focus on legibility, understand hierarchy in terms of like, what do you want your viewer to read first, second, third, fourth, and then treat your type accordingly, right? Don't use too many type treatments and styles in terms of bold, italic, that sort of thing. The approach that I take with typography is that it's simpler is better, right? Don't get too crazy. A lot goes a long way. A little goes a long way. A lot goes a lot long way. So, yeah, I don't know that there's any one website where you could go to and learn about it, unfortunately. I think you kind of pick these things up, looking at all different types of things and seeing like what works, what doesn't work. But yeah, I think the world opens up to you when you start to look at products and services in a way that's typographically focused, right? Type is a very passive thing. You could look at something and not even realize that the typography is a problem and just have a bad feeling about it. Go, I don't like that. I can't read that or whatever, and not really even think about like what the problems are. So if you start looking at things and thinking about it, and really paying attention to the type and saying, oh, how could that be better? Then I think that's a good way to learn.
So, yeah, I mean, hopefully everyone looks at the slides for this week and realizes that there's only one font being used. All right. I guess, where do you find yourself challenged the most right now? What's the hardest thing that you do as a creative director?
Yeah. I mean, I saw that question on your sheet, and I was like, that's a tough one. You know,
maybe what you've done and what you enjoy the least, besides all the paperwork, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I enjoy the least is the billing and the go out and get sales and try to keep the pipeline full and all that stuff that's part of a normal business. That I'm an artist at my heart. I'm an artist. I don't want to do that stuff, right? And some cases I've been able to hire people to go out and do that stuff for me, bookkeeping, accounting. But that's the stuff that's hardest for me, man, is like trying to go and be a salesperson, trying to be an HR guy, trying to be these roles that I'm not. But if any of you are thinking about starting a small business, a studio, web design, whatever it is, you got to wear a lot of hats, and that's part of it. So,
well, how much you said you're an artist, but how much of a programmer are you? Would you say that you're into that too?
I've hired people to do the programming. So I have developers. That's not one of my favorites. So I in college, during the first web expansion, I realized, hey, I could actually not have to get a college job, like a typical job, if I could learn HTML and learn how to code. And so I did learn enough of that back then. But that's light years away from where it is today. I would have a really hard time going and coding a website right now. I don't know that I could do that. I could probably open up some web files and tweak some stuff, but you know, I don't do that so much anymore. It was never really compatible with me.
Because we have a question from Eric about will you be happy that Flash is dead after December? I think that's more of a programming, but maybe you have an opinion on it. Here's some other things just before you get to that. Yep. Flash, you can give that a thumbs up or thumbs down. As far as CSS, Flex versus Gridbox, that's another interesting thing, versus Bootstrap, like you've already mentioned. Are any of these technologies dying, or any of these technologies up and coming, or do you care, or do you just like send your programmers out to worry about that stuff?
So typically the programmers will worry about that stuff. I actually don't know what Flexbox is. I saw that and I looked it up and like, this is the type of thing that I typically would design with a grid. And then I'll let my developers, and I explain to them what we're trying to do. And I let my developers figure out like the best way to execute on that. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you on that. Flash, yeah, the one thing that was great about Flash, and like I said, my background is I'm more of a designer, less of a developer. So Flash was kind of cool because I could go in and I could make little movies or little things, and I could charge my clients for that work, and I didn't have to bring a developer in. And obviously there's tools right now also that let you do web builds and that sort of thing. But at the time I was kind of excited about it, but I don't think we've done anything with Flash in like 7-8 years. It's sort of, I mean, I'm surprised to hear that it's gone in December. I thought it was gone years ago.
It's just the technical death of Flash, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think unless there are any more questions, I think we can wrap up the Q&A.
Yeah.
Dr. Cade,
I don't know how much time we have, but I did have some projects I could walk you through if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, we have some time. Maybe you could show some of the designs that you've been working on, or maybe some of your favorite designs.
Yeah,
Just
I'll run
to
through
give some
quickly.
concrete examples. Yeah.
Yeah. One second here. I had it lined up and now it's not. Okay. I'll show you like 6 projects. So
Sure.
Your students. So maybe you would recognize Chegg. Are you guys familiar? I don't know if you're familiar with Chegg or not, but they're a company that does textbook rentals, tutoring. Yeah, they're focused on students. There's their audience. I worked with them extensively for about 3 years, working on a career app and website. So it's specifically focused on matching employers with interns or recently graduated students for specific jobs. So it's a job site for students, basically. We worked on, here you can see it's an app, but also there was sort of a web application desktop experience for this as well. So worked with Chegg on that. And this would be an example of like when they already have a visual language established. They already know what the buttons look like. They already know what links are. And we're going and using that toolkit, using their icons and stuff and putting it all together, arranging it in a way that serves an objective. PayPal, obviously I do a ton of work with them. So we do everything from front-facing websites that customers might interact with to something like what you're seeing here, which is a little bit hard to see, obviously, but this is an example of like what they would call onboarding for large vendors. So a company like McDonald's might come to them and say, hey, we want to let people pay with PayPal, right? And so in order to facilitate that, PayPal would say, cool, come to our portal, log in with these passwords or whatever, and then you need to tell us information about how you want this set up. Do you want one PayPal account that all of your McDonald's locations will feed into, and then when you get reports on that, like you just see like one account, or do you want a separate account for all of your locations, or do you want it broken down so that managers can see one thing but corporate HQ can see another thing? So designing the tools that allow them to have those interactions with their customers. Getting even more behind the scenes at PayPal, some of the things that we do are visual data visualization for business metrics. So creating sites that the CEO or CMO or top level execs at PayPal would come to see, like, how's my business doing? How's how are these sectors doing? You know, and really kind of designing pages for them to figure out, like, you know, to see where they're at so they can help to make decisions based on that. So we've been doing a lot of work with that with them for the past 5 years. This is kind of like business dashboards. More on the customer facing side, this is a website we designed for Samsung for their developer conference. So it's both informational, you know, telling people what's going to be at their developer conference, and then also allowing them to register and see their schedule and register for sessions and that sort of thing. So like an e-commerce portion to it as well.
You got a very big header there and a big header here.
Yeah, yeah. They wanted it to be more image focused and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's big headers, and then as you scroll down, they kind of like would shore up towards the top of the page. And a big header here as well. So this is a site and work that we did for TD Ameritrade. So every month we would do a newsletter that they put out. We would design it and develop it and QA it, and then hand it over to them, and they would send it out to all of their financial advisors. Again, yes, this is a little bit old, and that's maybe why some of this stuff has big headers. But yeah, this one happened to have a large banner, and that was a big part of the work every month was, hey, what's your lead article? And then how can we support that lead article? We had to come up with visuals to support that headline, whether that be an illustration or photo or whatever. But you can see, we talked about consistency earlier. You can see that each one of these is consistent, and that button placement is always the same. It's always got a title, some supporting text, and then imagery kind of off to the right. And then, you know, I don't have it here to show, but how does that reflow for mobile? You know, we need to make sure that the image typically is either self-contained, floating in the middle, or it falls off on the right side and the bottom, so that when you go to mobile, it can be stacked. It can go below the headline, and we can have the image sort of blur off, fade off towards the top. So considering desktop and mobile. Just a couple more here. We designed the help center for Upwork. So if you're familiar with Upwork, it's like a freelance website. You design the help center. Very simple, very clean, very, not a lot of crazy visuals going on. They just wanted something very simple. And again, another example of when they already had like a library of styles. We come in and utilize sort of the styles that they have in place. And lastly, this is some work we did for SanDisk. So SanDisk, obviously, they do like memory cards and that sort of thing, thumb drives. We designed and developed all of their HTML emails, and sometimes those emails would click through to landing pages that we would design and build as well. So, you know, holidays and sales and, you know, several per month that we would do for them.
I think I've seen some of those in the past, actually.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So that kind of gives you a sense of the type of work that we're doing in the web design and web application space.
Well, that was quite the tour, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah,
it's a good example of a lot of different types of sites with different objectives. So yeah.
Cool.
A quick question from Eric. Do you basically use ready sources for your images, or do you have people to create them?
It depends. So typically we'll use like Unsplash, free imagery. It's just the non-friction way to go with clients, is that you don't have to come back to them and say, yeah, we told you that the site was this amount, but also you need to pay for all your licensing of images, and it's X amount, right? If we use Unsplash and we explain that to them, like, hey, it's free, it's free licensing, they're usually pretty happy with that. Next step, if they say, we don't want to use that stuff, we have like an iStock account or something, then sometimes clients will have like an actual account with a stock photo site. They'll give us a password. We'll go in and select the images for them to use. And then occasionally the client will want something that's a little bit more custom, and they'll have us design it, or we can hire an illustrator to work on that. If it's something really simple like icons and that sort of thing, we just usually build that into the cost of the project. But it just kind of depends.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say unsplash. As a college professor, I don't really want to pay for stock photos. So,
yeah, I mean, sometimes it's great to be able to use that. I don't advocate. I mean, I like photographers getting paid for their work, you know, and so I think a lot of, if my photography friends would heard me say that, to be like, come on, man. But yeah, it's the reality of it. If it's out there, it's a free. My clients are going to want to use it if it's good. So
right.
And sometimes we'll use Unsplash as placeholders for work, and we'll say, hey, this is Unsplash stuff, and they might say, okay, cool, well, let's find something similar that's, you know, royalty free or, you know, licensed or something like that. So
at DVD we use iStock. iStock seems to be a good source of decent images.
yeah, one way to get yourself in trouble is if you use placeholder images that you intend to update later, but they are just grabbed from the internet or from someone else's, you know, whatever, that's not licensed to you and you don't have license to use, and then your client ends up loving it and you just kind of forget to go back and replace it with something that's kosher. That's a good way to get in trouble, right? So you always want to, I guess, start with Unsplash, start with something that's specifically free, that you have the rights to use. I would never use something that, even for placeholder, that you just grabbed off the internet, because people fall in love with it, clients fall in love with it, and then you're kind of like, you need to sort of like grab it back away from them and say, it's actually not ours, we can't use it, or you might forget, and yeah, that's not good either.
That's really good advice.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think I want to say thanks, Ian. It was really a lot of fun to see a lot of different designs and aspects of what it takes to be in the digital world.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it, and thanks. And
Yep,
I'll
thanks
see you
so
around.
much. Very
Yeah,
interesting, very informative.
great. Hey, nice to meet you guys, or nice to meet you.
All right.
Okay, bye.